the next thing I wanted to talk about that came from this conference and the declaration that came out of it was about the so the declaration of the conference stated that the triumph of the Battle of Cuito Valley resulted in the liberation of Angola and Namibia, and it paved the way for negotiations that ultimately brought an end to the apartheid regime in South Africa. So I would like to hear from both of you on what is the historical background of the Battle of Cuito Valley, and what role did it play in freeing South Africa from apartheid?
Well, you're touching on what was a big obsession of my life, right? So, to provide for the broader historical context is that, Cuito Carnival and the end of apartheid in South Africa has to be seen as part of this grand picture of the anti-colonial national liberation struggle in Africa that emerges in the 50s and 57. We have Ghana becoming independent, and it really accelerates into the 60s and so forth, right? So I think that's critically important. One of the things that I think emerges to place it in the context of Cuba is particularly in the question of the Southern African liberation struggles. And it fits in that if anyone who studies the history of colonialism, the end of colonialism, particularly in Africa, people talk about the peaceful transition and so on. But the point is, it all involves some level of militancy and violence. In Ghana, when the British did leave peacefully, it was after a confrontation where they shot down striking veterans and so forth. They threw Kwame Nkrumah into prison, and he has the merit of having been actually whisked from the dungeons of the British colonial empire, right? When he was imprisoned, to the office of of the premiership, right? Okay, but it's when we get to the settler colonial states, right, that we have this vicious struggle that emerges, right? And so, at one point, when you have Britain and France recognizing that perhaps, even though, and I always like to point this out to my students, it's interesting to note that World War II comes to an end in 1945, and Ghana isn't independent until 1957. Yet in 1941, the Churchill and Roosevelt met off the coast of Newfoundland, okay, and basically promulgated the Atlantic Charter, which recognized the right of self-determination for everybody, and that every people should govern themselves, right? And of course, that was done at a time of crisis. Who knew who was going to win the war? Germany was in ascendancy. So when the war comes to an end in 1945, Britain wants to forget that promise, and France doesn't really want to have any part of it. They want to preserve their empires, right? By the time the 60s roll around and they faced all of this resistance, they know the British know they can't maintain the control in Nigeria, in Ghana, in Kenya. We have a struggle because Kenya was a colonial settler state as well. And even though the British were able to suppress it for a time and imprison tens of thousands, up to over 100,000 people, execute hundreds of people, they realized the rule was untenable, right? But it's in places like Portugal and so forth where the British and the French realize, and in a sense, they could leave but still remain and maintain some form of neo-colonial control. And we see the result of that, particularly in Francophone West Africa today with the rebellions taking place, right? Where people recognize, yes, we may have flag independence, what we call nominal independence, but the formal political and economic structures, particularly this subordinate, continues. In the 60s, what we see, and this comes us into the Cuban War, in the 60s, the Cuban Revolution triumphs, and Cuba supports these national liberation struggles. They support the Algerians. They send a contingent of doctors to Algeria. Pero Glejeses, in his monumental work, Conflicting Missions, Havana, Washington, and Africa, 1959 to 1976. It's a brilliant book, and he documents this. Horace Campbell, a professor from emeritus, former president from Syracuse, has written about this. Victoria Britton, a journalist, they've written all about these early beginnings. Cuba supported all of these national liberation struggles in Africa, all these anti-colonial national liberation struggles. But they developed a particular relationship with those who were struggling against Portuguese colonialism, because Portugal was one of the weaker countries in Western Europe. They'd had a presence for over 500 years in Africa, so a 500-year colonial empire. They did not want to lose their colonies because of their economic importance, because they were economically backward, if we may use that term, compared to the Western countries. And also, it would be a loss of prestige. They would no longer have the empire. And so they waged a war in Mozambique and Angola and Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, right? Waged this war against the national liberation struggle. And I always have to make this point, and I had this discussion recently with other people. All of the Africans, organizations who attempted to bring about freedom, tried to do it peacefully, and through means, right, of of moral persuasion, and also went to international forum. It's only when all of these things failed and the demands for greater rights were faced by violence that he took up struggle. Same thing in South Africa with Mandela, the same thing with Amilcar Cabral, Agostinho Neto, and others, right, who were waging struggles in these Portuguese colonies. And the Portuguese themselves, were waging struggle with the support of NATO, right? In fact, they used napalm in Mozambique, right? And so it becomes a violent struggle. And Cuba developed a relationship with the MPLA, the Movement for the Popular Liberation of Angola, which was the major and the most broad-based liberation movement in Angola. And so they supported them in the struggle, right? What happens is that they're supporting them, providing all sorts of assistance, right? Training and education and so forth, okay? In fact, at one point, we know that in terms of Central Africa, Che Guevara in 1965 had participated in trying to organize an anti-colonial rebellion against what had happened in Congo when Patrice Lumumba was overthrown, right? And the US imposed a sort of a Western client ruler, right? Which was Mobutu. So if all of these are unfolding, to cut a long story short, to bring us closer to time, what happens is that in 1974, we have the Carnation Revolution in Portugal. So we're coming up to the 50th anniversary this year of the Carnation Revolution. And what had happened was the Portuguese could not win the war, even though the generals had frequently said that Africans, that Black people are inferior and could not defeat us. They had lost the war. And this war began to have an economic and social impact in Portugal. In fact, it radicalized a whole generation of these young officers. And so we have this Carnation Revolution that takes place, right? A really progressive revolution, almost a socialist revolution emerges in Portugal. And the Portuguese who overthrow their dictatorship, the military dictatorship, which is a fascist dictatorship, then declare that these wars are not only unjust, they're unwinnable, and we are going to facilitate their independence, right? And so what happens is suddenly South Africa, okay, which was this racist apartheid state, okay, which had normally seen Southern Africa in terms of economics, suddenly we're going to have independent Black states on its borders, right? That were hostile to apartheid, hostile to racist rule, right? And so they became extremely concerned about that. In fact, when the Soweto uprising takes place in 1976, right? People talk about how these young Black South Africans, this is when Black youth came out, right? Okay, in the streets, right? Against impositions in the education system, but really against apartheid as a whole. They were influenced. The commission, how they were influenced by what was happening in Angola and Mozambique as the Portuguese were being defeated, right? Okay, and that's critically important, right? And in fact, there were a long generation of young Black South Africans who were being influenced by the success of the liberation movement outside of the territories. Other blacks in Southern Africa were becoming free, right? At that moment, as Angola is about to become independent, the South Africa and the United States, right, with the support, decide that in order to preserve its illegal occupation of Namibia and to protect itself, it has to basically install a government of its own liking in Angola. And they invade Angola in October of 1970, a major invasion in October of 1975 that began a sort of an incursion in August of 75, but the major invasion is October 1975. At this time, the Cubans have military advisors, right? They're providing that kind of support and assistance. At this time, Angola, okay, the Movement for Popular Liberation of Angola, okay, faces an existential crisis, right? And they issue an international SOS, right? And for assistance. And there's some African countries who actually are able to send small contingents. But it's the Cubans who respond, with eventually 36,000 troops ending up being in Angola. And they push the South Africans eventually out of Angola, right? Okay. There's an invasion of Zaire through what's called the Front for the National Liberation of Angola, which was really controlled by the CIA and the Zairean government, the corrupt Zairean government at that time. It's now known as Democratic Republic of Congo, but then it was known as Zaire. They're defeated. And so Angolan independence is preserved. And what happens is, for the first time, the invincible white army is defeated. The white invincibility is shattered, that aura. And it has a significant impact in South Africa, right? So I mentioned the Soweto uprising, which takes place on June 16, 1976, right? Okay, when that uprising takes place, people are drawing inspiration what's happened in Southern Africa. And some of them walk around with signs that say, if it happened in South Africa, it can happen here, right? If this white army can be, if it happened in Angola, rather, it can happen here. So if the white army can be defeated in Angola, it can be defeated there. And Black newspapers, talk about, the celebrations, right? This heady wine of liberation. And other newspapers talk about the celebration of Black South Africans, sort of involved in, because this myth of white invincibility is defeated. Now, the point about this whole long story, that sets up Cuba's long internationalist mission, which they call Operation Carlotta. It was on November the 5th they made that decision. Okay, the Politburo got together and they debated what should they do. And on November 5th, they made the decision that they were going to dispatch troops to Angola to defend its independence, right? And November 5th was very important, because on November 5th, 1843, there was a very significant slave uprising, rebellion against slavery, led by Carlotta, right? Okay, I think at the Triunvirato plantation. So this is making a direct connection to Cuba's deep historical connections with Africa through the transatlantic slave trade, but also there's a history of resistance in Cuba against slavery that plays a role in Cuba's national liberation struggles. So to cut a long story short, right, from 75 to 1988, right, okay, the South Africans transformed the apartheid state. They come to the conclusion that they face what they call a total onslaught from these states, and they say, communist onslaught, these Black people will reintroduce, the savage liberation. They didn't believe in one vote to one person, because Black people were going to be, contained as cheap labor and placed in very small Bantustans, enclaves, right, that they would control and so forth. So they saw themselves under assault, and they developed something called total strategy. And what that meant was they had to wage an entire onslaught in Southern Africa. So what people fail to understand is the struggle to liberate South Africa is part of a war that's waged in Southern Africa. The struggle for and against apartheid took place as much outside the borders as inside the borders. If you read the second volume of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, right, there's a whole report on South Africa outside its borders, right? And they conclude that tens of thousands of more people died outside the borders of South Africa than died inside, because South Africa waged a war of terror, right? They waged so for example, from 1981 to 1988, in some instances, people estimate over 1.5 million people were killed as a direct result of South Africa's military intervention and the support of various terrorist groups and economic sabotage. I've documented what people say are the economic costs, which were in billions of dollars, right? And so in a sense, that's just recent history. They waged this war of terror. And to wage this war of terror, they reorganized the apartheid state. They militarized it, right? Okay, and they developed something called a National Security Management System and something called a State Security Council, which used to be under cabinet, under cabinet control, right? In a sense, responsible to the cabinet and to the power, was now the sole decision-making body, which was controlled by the military. And P.W. Botha was the president at the time, was the former Minister of Defense, so he was heavily ensconced in the military. So the military was in control, and they waged this war of terror. And they adopted a strategy that their goal was basically at one point to install in southern Angola create a buffer state, an independent state led by the Union for the Total National Independence of Angola, called UNITA, which is really supported by the CIA in South Africa, led by Jonas Savimbi, a very brilliant man. Okay, spoke several languages. Even though he was he was basically a comprador, you could argue, in the hands of the U.S. imperialism and the South African racists. He was a brilliant man, and Che Guevara himself had met him and saw him as a brilliant man in the 60s. Right? He himself basically would then become the leader of this rump state in South Angola, which would then lead to disintegration of Angola. So that was their goal, right? And so the South Africans also repeatedly launched series of military interventions all over Southern Africa, which is why Cuba, who were going to withdraw after driving the South Africans out in 1976, were asked to stay by the Angolans as part of a deterrent and a part of defending Angola's independence from frequent South African incursion. So a critical component of the apartheid state, the racist state's survival strategy, was not only to wage this war in southern Angola and southern Africa, which cost hundreds of thousands of lives, if not millions, right? And cost untold billions of dollars of economic damage, but specifically was focused on Angola itself. Angola was seen as the main arena. That sets us up for Quito Carnival, okay? And what would happen is the Cubans were in Angola specifically to defend Angolan independence. Okay, they didn't participate in the civil war that the MPLA waged against UNITA, right? They may have provided military advice, but UNITA UNITA, which was supported by the CIA and South Africa, that was seen as an internal matter for the Angolans, right? But the Angolans would sometimes launch these offensives against UNITA, would be on the verge of destroying UNITA, and the South Africans would intervene, right?